Hello and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. I'm Natalie MacDonald, bringing you yet another exclusive interview. Now, joining us for the first of two interviews today, discussing two hot stories impacting the global markets, is John Hancock. John, thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, firstly, we're going to be discussing Syria today. So, John, can you bring us up to speed on the latest developments on Syria's landscape?
Well, what's really happened, Natalie, is that Syria's gone from being a forgotten war that's raged on within Syria's borders and everyone's ignored it, to being something that now threatens to break national governments, upset the stability of the international community, destroy a G20 meeting. I mean, it's gone global. So in that sense, it's utterly changed in the space of three weeks. What's happening in terms of the conflict itself, of course, is this ongoing stalemate. I mean, no one can realistically suggest that they know how this will turn out, who the victor will be, who the losers are, except that the carnage increases.
Now, if we look, for example, at military intervention, the US are in, the UK is out for now, and Parliament in France still seems to be divided on the issue. Now, if we combine this stance with, say, for example, the EU-US cybersecurity dispute that took place earlier in the year, are we seeing a growing chasm between EU-US relations and the synergy that we've seen in the past on similar matters?
Well, look, it's easy to see this as a new development or a shocking development for President Obama, or a giant change in the role of the transatlantic community, but I don't think it is that different. I mean, the reality is the United States is the last surviving global policeman. I mean, the EU has consistently had a divided foreign policy, or a weak foreign policy. We see the Arab League coming out to support the intervention in Syria, but no concrete initiatives from them. The rest of the international community is watching what unfolds. The UN Security Council is obviously completely frozen. It's left to the US, so we should be entirely surprised that the ball finds itself squarely in President Obama's court, and indeed now in the Congress's court.
And how much do you think the backlash against previous similar scenarios, take Iraq, Afghanistan, for example, and also the cost of intervention, how much is this playing on policymakers' minds, do you think?
Oh, I think a great deal. It's an excellent question, Natalie. I mean, in some ways, we're refighting the debates on Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're dealing with a public opinion that feels burnt by those conflicts, that feels cheated, misled, lied to even. So suddenly when politicians, political leaders in Britain, France, the United States stand up and say, we have evidence that crimes against humanity have been committed, immediately, of course, people go back in their minds and replay the text of Colin Powell talking of the UN evidence of weapons of mass destruction. We hear replay of George Bush warning against the dire consequences of not taking action against Iraq. Having said all that, Syria is not Iraq. This is an entirely different kind of conflict, an entirely different situation. I have to say, I feel extremely sorry for Barack Obama. I mean, we live in a very weird world where Vladimir Putin, the ex-KGB agent, the man who oversaw the destruction of Chechnya, is somehow virtuous and heroic, and the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize is the villain. What's happened to world public opinion? I mean, if you have international law, which we do on chemical weapons attacks, if we have UN conventions on the responsibility to protect, as we do have, there is a law that's been broken. There is a line that's been crossed in this issue, and I think President Obama's instincts on this are frankly correct. And the arguments you hear against it, well, there's other atrocities being committed in this war. Why didn't you act on that? There are other countries that do bad things. Why didn't you act on that? That seems to me to be a fallacious argument. I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. The fact that you cannot cure every conflict in the world doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to cure or solve the conflict that you're faced with. The fact that you can't prevent every atrocity in the world doesn't mean that when you have the means to try to prevent an atrocity, you shouldn't do it. We have laws because we assume that these laws will be enforced. If we don't enforce them, the laws are meaningless.
If we end then on this idea of cost, what could the cost be to the region as a whole economically? And similarly, quite often when we're discussing items such as social unrest in the region, which we've seen a huge amount of in recent months, in relation to items such as the cost of oil, often guests turn around and say, this is the Middle East, we're used to it. But for how much longer can being used to social and political volatility continue to act as a buffer against economic deterioration?
Very good point. Again, Natalie, a very good point. I mean, we talk about the Syrian conflict, but you're right. Today we're talking about the Syrian conflict. A month ago we were talking about Egypt. Before that we were talking about mass protests in Turkey. A year before that it was the wave of unrest, the Arab Spring sweeping through North Africa. In many ways, this region is a giant civil conflict, civil war, that's threatening to degenerate into sectarian violence in a number of countries, that has very serious overtones and knock-on effects in neighboring Turkey and neighboring Iran. So to see it as purely a Syrian problem is ignoring the obvious convulsions that are gripping the region as a whole. Is it fair to say that that this is going to have economic consequences? Of course it will. I mean, it's already being reflected in the price of oil and uncertainty about the global recovery. I mean, this has always been a strategic crossroads, not just for energy reasons, but for trade reasons because of its location between Asia and Europe. I think that's one point. A deeper point is that the region as a whole is facing its own economic crisis. We're talking about a region that's had extraordinary population growth, has huge levels of unemployment in a number of these countries. I mean, Palestine, half the young people are unemployed. Syria is an economic mess. Turkey is having trouble absorbing its young. Leave aside the success cases, the Saudi Arabias of this world that have gone from having negligible populations 80 years ago, 100 years ago, to 25 million people now. Yemen, by 2050, according to some projections, will have a bigger population than all of Russia. And it's an economy that rests exclusively on one product, really, energy. If you extract energy, the resource sector from the Middle Eastern economy, I think the combined export power of the Middle East amounts to Italy's export power, the whole of the Middle East. So it's a region that's fragile, that has a huge population base, a restless young male unemployed population base, and now an energy future that, because of the shale gas revolution, the fracking revolution, discoveries elsewhere, is starting to look less certain. So as the Middle East, we're worried about the economic knock-on effects, but maybe at some level, a lot of this unrest is a symptom of a long-term economic uncertainty and perhaps a long-term economic decline.
John, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Coming up next, Yellen versus Summers. It's the big debate. We'll be back shortly with more on Mr. Ben Bernanke's replacement. Goodbye for now.